Yeah, I'm going to bring the pace of the conference down a notch or two, I think, because after the excellent speakers we've had so far, I'm going to present what I've been told is the most boring PowerPoint presentation in the history of the medium. And it's probably not untrue, but I have an excuse, and my excuse is that it's official data. And the reason I focus on official data is because there's very little of it in this economy, and it comes out very much after time, and basically there's a lack of disclosure and a lack of transparency, which you don't tend to see in other European economies. I don't really want to go into why that's the case. I have a strong view on why that's the case, and I think it's to do with the formation of this state and the inheritance it had and its unwillingness to change that inheritance, but that's a different matter. What I want to focus on instead is the official dialogue and official debate and the official narrative in this economy always looks at the world through the wrong end of the telescope, because it starts with the deficit. And the deficit is a symptom of the crisis, not its cause. So in time-honoured fashion, I'm going to start looking at the world through the wrong end of the telescope, and I'm going to look at the deficit too, because that's what's familiar. And my first point, in amidst all this flurry of data, is to point out that all this data comes from the National Income and Expenditure accounts for 2010. And they don't come out until, well, they came out about, I think, 6 weeks, 2 months ago, long after time. But they're much more detailed than what we are presented with in the quarterly national accounts. I think I'm right in saying every other Western European economy presents its quarterly national accounts on a threefold basis, which is it presents income, output and expenditure. All you get from the CSO is expenditure. You don't get the others at all until you wait for this, and you have to piece it together in a very haphazard and random way that I've done. That's a big failing. And it's not about statistics and it's not about data. It's about public accountability, public transparency, and the level of the debate that takes place. But here we go, the deficit. The deficit clearly arises from an excess of expenditure over income. But actually what's happened is we've had a collapse of income. We haven't had a surge in expenditure. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm assuming that most here, maybe apart from some representatives of the media, will tend to agree with me. But what I would like to point out is that the strategy isn't working. Deficit isn't coming down. If you abstract from this, and I think it's line 20, well, it'll be there somewhere. The borrowing total is line 236. But what you need to take out from that is the subsidies, the Anglo-Irish nonsense and all that sort of stuff. And if you take out all those subsidies that go back over years, what you'll find is that the deficit is actually rising, and it's still rising, i.e. the current strategy isn't working, it's not going to work. And I would like to point out at this point that one of my particular bugbears in relation to the Macarthur Report. The Macarthur Report was a very interesting exercise because it had self-set terms of reference. It's very unusual. And the first point of the self-set term of reference that was adopted by the Macarthur Report was, to quote, the elimination of the deficit by 2011. Well, as Sarah Palin might say, that ain't really working out, is it? It's not only not being eliminated, it's increasing. The current strategy doesn't work. Now, here are some even greater detail. I provided it because I obviously don't expect people to itemise it now, still less to memorise it, but actually just to show that what's happening on the expenditure side. Because what I've identified is that there's a collapse in income, i.e. taxation income, in this economy, which is the cause of the deficit. But on the expenditure side, it's actually very difficult in a recession to get expenditure down. If you have any type of social safety net whatsoever, the expenditure on those elements of the budget will tend to rise if you have a recession. And as fast as you keep cutting benefits, if the numbers of people in poverty or in unemployment rise at a greater rate, your expenditure on those items will rise faster, no matter how hard and how fast you keep cutting them. And of course, if you cut them, that means that their consumption goes down, and guess what? That puts someone else out of a job. Those are the boring bits, I think, out of the way. Now, this, I was told, was the least clear chart that anyone had ever presented to a conference, which is a shame. It's a shame. It may be true, but it's a shame. What it actually is towards the end of last year, Gavin Davis used to be the chief economist at Goldman Sachs in London. He did a chart in his blog on the FT, which he called the most important chart of the year. And in it wasn't this one, it was a forerunner of this one. What he had was a chart showing private consumption, private savings in the US and public savings, i.e. the deficit. And there were a number of readers of the blog, including myself, who pointed out that lumping the private sector together wasn't actually very helpful, because there's two components to the private sector, which is the household sector and the business sector. So in response, he came up with this chart. Now, what this shows, he's still very much attached to his total private sector stuff. That's the bars in the chart. But in the, he's disaggregated it. He's separated the business and the household sectors. And what you see there is a very different picture. And the phrase he used, a very good phrase, I thought. He talked about the normal functioning of any market economy. In the normal functioning of any market economy, what you'll have is that blue line is positive. That blue line is the savings of the household sector. And what you have in a normal working market economy simultaneously is the red line should be a negative number, i.e. that the business sector should be a borrower. The mechanism for transferring those savings from one to the other is the banking system. And that's what it's supposed. That is its utility function. That's what it's supposed to do. We know it does a lot of other things very spectacularly badly as well. But what's interesting about that process, and this is for the United States, but it goes for this country with a quirk that I'll come on to. What's interesting about that is that, in general, apart from the period in the run-up to the current crisis, i.e. in the lead-up to 2007, is the household sector is always a saver. It's always got positive savings on a net basis. It doesn't mean to say that everyone in the country has got positive savings, but on a net basis, the savings are always positive. What happens is, in the red line, is that occasionally the business sector doesn't borrow, it starts to save. And those are always recessions. That's actually the cause of all recessions. It's the business sector's refusal to invest. Business sector starts to refuse to invest because it doesn't see its way to making a profit. The purpose of business is business. They're not in it as a charitable function to make widgets, because tomorrow they might stop making widgets and start making steel cans instead, or they might make steel plates, or they might take over a retirement care home because there's more money in that and with no expertise to do it. But that's what they do. They're in it to make money. And if they don't see their way to making money, they'll stop investing. And that's the cause of recessions. When that happens, deficits happen. Government deficits happen. Because you can't all be a saver at once. If everyone else is saving, someone else has got to be a borrower. You can't all save money with each other. So what happens is the public sector deficit is always a function of the corporate sector's savings. Give or take, sometimes you can get just mismanagement. You have, on a persistent basis, you have deficits even in boom times, which is where you have incomes from taxation which are below the level of expenditure, which is a country like Greece. It's not a country like Ireland. Ireland had a surplus going into the crisis, so did Spain have a surplus going into the crisis. What it's a function of is the refusal of the private sector to invest. That's what causes crises. That's what caused this crisis. The exceptional feature is the household sector in this case, and that was true of Ireland too. The household sector became a net borrower. And then we had these sort of what people now call the party time of the boom and so on and so on. But that's exceptional. And the reason they did that is because of the pressure on the housing sector. There was a determination that everyone had to have a house, because if you didn't buy a house, you would never get the chance again because prices were rocketing so high. And a function of the fact that household incomes were actually flat or falling in general in the Western economies. But when they went back to normal functioning, that wasn't the cause of the crisis. The cause of the crisis is the fact that the corporate sector is now a massive saver. But if it's a massive saver, that means that the we don't have an end result which is disaster. Because what that means is there are savings of the corporate sector, i.e. they're sitting on huge cash balances. And it's true in this country just as much as it's true in America. I'll skip this one.
2 minutes, yeah.
Sorry. What this shows is the savings of the different sectors: personal, companies, central government. And what's interesting about this is that the personal sector is a saver, but that's its job, that's what it's supposed to do, that's the normal function of a market economy. What we've seen, the bottom line, is that the balance, or the savings balance of central and local government has gone into a deficit. But the reason that has happened is because for a prolonged period in this economy, the private sector, the corporate sector component of it, has been a saver. It hasn't been a net investor, i.e. its investment level is below its level of profits. And that's the key. So when anybody says, we don't have any money, we're broke, there's no means to this, all this stuff that Michael Taft was talking about is all very nice, but so is motherhood and apple pie, and we don't have the money to do it, it's just plain wrong. There are huge cash balances in this country held by the corporate sector. All we have to do is really small technical matter to end recession and to end it permanently, is take a little bit of it from them.